In this movie we're going to have a look at preparing a 3D document. Before we begin, I'm just going to insert a window to this wall. I'll just insert it about here, doesn't really matter. Let's have a look at the way this window sits in this wall, because the way that windows are inserted and displayed is also linked to the new composite walls and the display of composite walls. At this moment we can see that both the external and the internal plaster turns around and butts up against the frame. If we set the display to core only, you'll have just the core and it'll show where the window sits. If we set it to core and non-core without the finishes, again that's the display that we're going to get. So I'm just going to set it to entire structure and put that back down there. And I'm just going to check that quickly in 3D. Obviously the window is there, everything seems to be working. To start preparing a 3D document, first we have to define an area that we want to present. I'm just going to pick this area here. There's two corners of this wall, including the window. I'll do this by picking the marquee tool, and obviously if you had a multi-story building you could use the multi-level marquee. I'm just going to use the single one in this instance, and just drag an area over here. This is the area that we want to see in the 3D document. Now I'm just going to switch to the 3D view, in which I can set the view, and we can set it to be axonometric or parallel or perspective view, and we can adjust the perspective whatever we want just by moving our mouse around. And then we can go to the menu, document, 3D document, create 3D document. Then it asks for a reference ID and a name. As soon as we push create, in our browser or navigator we have a new folder called 3D Documents, and the display is set to the internal shading. This is obviously a two-dimensional representation, but it actually has quite a lot of 3D information in it, as you will see in a moment. We can turn the grid display off if you don't want to see that. And with the 3D document selected, the one that we just created, we can go to the settings and we can have a look at the settings. Under general we have the reference and the name. Status, which is auto rebuild, which means that every time there's a change in the floor plan, this change will be reflected in the 3D document. So I'm just going to move that window a little bit, go back to the 3D document, and we can see that it's being rebuilt automatically and it will move. Just like that. Now back to the settings. We can redefine the 3D projections, which would allow us to tweak the position of the camera and the sun if you need it. Push OK. We can also redefine the filter elements. By clicking on that, this would allow us to define the story that the 3D document will show, and whether the elements which are selected inside the marquee should be shown or the elements outside of the marquee. So we could actually cut a hole in a model rather than show a corner of the model. So that's a pretty neat feature. Well, just like that. So the corner's missing there, and we can flip that around. Trim elements to marquee. So we're going to use the marquee as the cutting boundary, and then we can decide what elements should be visible or invisible in the 3D document. If I, for example, turn the window off and push OK, the opening's there, but but the actual window is hidden now. I'm just going to redefine again. If I turn the walls off, obviously the windows will automatically turn off because the windows have to be hosted in a wall. So that's how we specify the different objects that are shown in the 3D model display. Under model display settings, there are the settings for the cut elements, the fill cut surfaces. At the moment, by default is cut fills as in settings, which is reading the settings. I'll just OK this, which is reading the settings following the complex profiles in our walls. So the hatchings and the colours are showing. We could change this if we wanted to uniform material, in which case it's showing just one pen colour there. We could also say own material colours, non-shaded, which would display in a solid colour once again, or shaded with a solid colour but taking in consideration the sun settings. The other option under uncut elements is the fill uncut surfaces, and this deals with the display of the surfaces at the moment. At the moment it says own material colours, non-shaded. We can see that these are the colours that have been specified in the materials used, the wood, the render, and we could say set it to uniform pen colours and set some sort of colour, white or anything we need, in which case it would take away from the complexity of the drawing but benefit the actual section. So the actual cut elements we can see a bit clearer like that. If I go down to own material, own colours, shaded, which will show the same information but it will take into consideration the light from the light source. So I'm just going to leave that as non-shaded. Vectorial hatching can be turned on and off, which refers to the surfaces rather than the cut elements. Then if we check the 3D vectorial hatching and the transparency, we can turn on and off the transparency in the window. As you can see, we can see through the window at the moment, and the vectorial hatching is also displayed now. If I go back to settings, the last setting there is the sun and shadows. Vectorial sun shadows is off at the moment. We can display those with contours on or contours off, and these are quite similar to what you'd expect from the ArchiCAD's internal rendering engine and similar sorts of displays. And you can see the shadows as cast from those elements that are visible in that view. So I'm just going to turn those back off. This makes it a bit clearer. And despite the fact that the 3D document appears to be a two-dimensional drawing and it can't be orbited or the view can't be changed within this window, the objects that are shown are actually still recognized as the original 3D object. For example, a slab, you can still see it's a slab there, and I can change the thickness of the slab there, which will be updated both in sections and elevations, and even on the 3D document. Just going to put that back to what it was before. It takes a moment to generate this 3D document, but the same thing applies to walls, because this is a complex profile, and if I increase the height of it to 4 meters, I could also change the size of the window if I wanted to. Just going to make it really large so it comes through the section. And as you zoom in onto those elements, you can see that they're all positioned correctly and correctly displayed on the screen. One thing you can't do, you can't actually move the window up or down or sideways. If you needed to reposition it, you would actually have to go back to the plan or use the numerical input to define the new position. So we're just going to return it to what it was before, and still having 3D elements displayed in here, it's actually possible to dimension this drawing. I'm going to go to the dimensioning tool and I'll choose the arrows, I'll choose a different marker, and I'll also turn off horizontal so the text can actually be aligned to the dimension line rather than forced to be horizontal. And with the dimension tool I can just point to an intersection and click, and I click the bottom of the wall, double click down there and position my dimension in 3D. Now that looks correct and the height's correct. The only issue with it is that when we dimension parts of the section of the wall, we don't actually associate those dimensions with the object. If I pick the wall now and change its height to 4 meters, that dimension is not going to follow. To have the dimensions associated with those 3D objects, you actually have to find points where those 3D objects have nodes. So that wall's got a node there and there. Now this is reading 3100 because it's reading the drop down in that wall. Now I'm just going to pick all the walls and change the heights of them to 3.5 meters, and that dimension is going to follow. So now it's reading 3.6 obviously. Dimensions in 3D or in the 3D document can also be edited just like dimensions on the floor plan. So first you have to select the actual dimension string, and then you press it again, just left mouse click on it again, and then the pet palette comes up. The second button in the pet palette allows us to add another dimension to the string that's selected. So now we can see that the window sill's at 1 meter. I'm going to click on the node, upper node of the window. We can see that the window is 1500. Now if I click on it again with my left mouse, the pet palette comes up again. I can also edit the length of the witness line. I can move it closer to the building. I can also move the dimension string closer to the building or anywhere I like. And I can, and then the fifth button, I can offset the dimension plane, so I can move it further away or bring it closer to the front of our model. And once again those dimensions are associated. So now if I change the height of the window, all the dimensions which are associated, because we've selected nodes on each individual object, will stay associated and correct. You can also add labeling to the 3D document just like you would to your normal plan views. Another thing worth mentioning about the 3D documents is that just like in any other view, can be stripped of non-core and finish elements. In here you can see the entire structure is being displayed. If I click on core only, we can see the core, so there's just the stud work thickness of it, and we can also say without finishes. Because I've used the complex profile here and assigned the material styrofoam to this particular layer of this composite profile, we can see the bubble vector hatch now showing over the whole wall or the whole face of this particular wall. So if I go back to entire structure, we can see the render now again. You can save all these views as separate views. So this can be quite a useful feature to very clearly illustrate how your building goes together.